All right then. Like I said, good to see all the smiling faces. So we are deep into the middle of the retreat now. A lot of you have used time well. Most of you have used the time well to practice and develop your mind. And we've been going deeper and deeper into the understanding of the mind that we've been discussing. So I'll just quickly review some of the things we discussed and what we talked about yesterday and set the stage for today's discussion. So we started with skills that we want to build about our mind, right? We started with understanding mindfulness and harmonious practice or 6 hours. Remembering where our attention is at any point of time, how is it moving from one thing to another. And when we understand that it is in a place where we don't want it to be, we are able to bring it back without any violence, which is harmonious practice or using the 6 hours. The third skill we learned about is collectedness. What happens when our mind starts learning as we keep bringing it back to our object of meditation? We bring it back to an anchor. It could be the object of meditation. If you're involved in a task, it could be the task itself. As we keep bringing it back from other things that distract it, the mind starts to get understand what we want to do, starts to stay with the object, starts to stay there effortlessly and without chasing after different distractions while remaining aware of what's happening. It doesn't close down on the object of meditation and say that I don't want anything, I don't know anything else in the world like this. It is aware of what else is happening, but starts staying there effortlessly, which is the third skill of collectedness, being able to stay with the object without any great effort, right? After that, we talked a little bit about a slice of time. So we talked first about how attention moving from one thought to another, to the next, forms our unique experience of life. Then in this, now we're going to zoom in a little bit, right? So we talked about a moment in time. What are the ingredients required which make up our experience in a moment of time? So there is the aspect of the physical realm, which is processed by our sense bases, right? So physical information, matter, electromagnetic radiation, mental information presented in different ways. So that is the physical realm. Then we have sensations associated with that moment of experience. What is the sensation? Is it a positive sensation, neutral sensation, unpleasant sensation? What is the sensation associated with that? We have information processing, making sense of what's happening, differentiating things, putting stuff together, you know, assimilating things, bringing things together, breaking them apart to figure out what's happening. That is Vigyan or consciousness, our information processing faculty. Then we have labels. We identify different parts of the experience as different things. So we have labels associated with that. We have concepts, right? This is the aggregate of Sangya or concepts, right? And finally, giving it your own unique flavor is underlying that is your sanskar or conditioning. So when all these five things come together, these are the ingredients of a slice of time, right? Of a moment in time. As we continue to zoom in, now we want to know how did we come to this moment in time? What happened? What is the process by which we were occupied in something and then suddenly we were occupied in something else? So this was a slice of time that looked very different. So right now, maybe you're paying attention to what I'm saying, and then maybe your phone rings or something falls down next to you. So somebody rings the bell, there's nobody at home, you have to go and take it. And suddenly your experience in that moment of time is very different. The physical realm is different, information processed is different, the feeling associated with it is different, the concepts associated with it is different, the way your conditioning is manifesting itself is different, right? So how do we go from one to another? So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's one of the central teachings of the Buddha. We'll get to that. Before that, I just wanted to start with our understanding of reality. So right now, you believe that I'm talking to you. You believe that in a way as if literally when you're listening to me, it doesn't matter whether I'm in the same room or I'm in a different city. My words, the sounds I'm making, my physical image is getting translated into digital information being transmitted through a very complex mechanism and then coming on to you on a device. So that's what's actually happening. But when we are talking, you assume that you're listening to me, right? Listening to me as you would be listening to somebody who's right next to you. We have models of reality. So we use models to understand reality. So I want to talk about this a little bit and then we get to the main part that we're going to discuss today, which is dependent origination. So I'll start with some visual aids for the day. I love this quote. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is attributed to a British statistician, George E.P. Box. People aren't sure whether it was he who said it, but that's not the point. So all models are wrong. What does it mean? So we use models to represent reality, right? So, for example, yesterday we saw, uh, caricature, line drawing that represented Mahatma Gandhi, but we were able to relate it to him. So all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we use models to approximate reality. We, like you, use a model of a person talking to you to understand this experience, right? So you don't think there is some things that are moving on the laptop, there is some sound being emitted. Now I have to make sense of this kind of information that is coming. That's absolutely not similar to the kind of interaction I have with a real human. But you use that model to make sense of reality. So models can be useful, but have you ever been surprised, right? You missed a step in a stair, or you stumbled on a stair because it was a little taller than the other. Something that happens, or somebody acts in a way that you just don't expect, either in a positive way or a negative. So what happens there? Your model is not sufficient to capture what the reality is. You are assuming that things will go according to the model, right? But what happens is that you may not be paying attention to reality. So this is very important. I'll just use a few examples to just illustrate this. Okay. So everyone can see this image and you can see two squares labeled A and B. I don't know if you've seen this, might be fairly common optical illusion. So to my mind, it looks like there is a chessboard or some kind of checkerboard portion of a chessboard, and there is a cylinder on top of it, and there's some shadow falling. So does anybody here believe that the square A and the square B are exactly the same color? So you can raise your hand. Are the square A and B the same color? Okay. So I've just put a rectangle which is like one color, and I can go back. Like now, does it look like the same color? For a little while, then it doesn't look like the same color. Now, does it look like the same color? So we have a model in our mind of a chessboard. We are assuming this is a chessboard, and that the different squares are alternating in color. That's what the model tells us, but the reality is actually different. I'll give you another example. So judges are expected to be professional, objective in their and impartial in their interpretation of the law. So I'm just quoting a study that was done around a dozen years back in Israel, and they took 1,000 cases of people coming up for parole in front of judges, and they saw what was the trend They took the morning session. They saw what was the trend when the session began and what was the trend just before it was time to break for lunch. And it was seen that in the beginning of the session, 65% of the people got parole. And by the time it was lunchtime and the objective judge was hungry, it went down to 0%. So it's not a difference of 5% or 2%. It went down to 0%. So people who are trying, so for them, they think they're experiencing reality, that I'm being just as I would be at any point of time, but it is just a model of reality, right? So they may actually, your model may be incorrect, it may not be useful. Models are useful for most of the time. So when we walk home, we know everything, or we drive home, we know where on the road, we know where the potholes are, where the speed breakers are. We don't really need to look at it and make sense of it, right? So if we have a vehicle coming towards us, we know that we need to get out of its way. We don't need to make sure that the vehicle is made of metal and not made of, say, thermocol, right? So we don't need to make sure of that. Models are useful most of the time, but models are not reality. They can deceive us, and we do get deceived by them many times. So how many times has anyone said, you always do this or you never do this? When you say things like that, you're reducing a person to a model, and that model may not always be correct. It will never be correct. All models are wrong, but it may not even be useful in that particular instance. Finally, just a big person. So just an example of when a model may be useful or not, right? So if you were to make a guess of whether this person can, whether you can adjust and squeeze this person on the bench next to you, you would probably be right. Your model of this person would be right. But if you were to guess uh, how good they are at their job, you may be completely off. Whether you assume they may be very good or you assume they may be very bad, you may be completely off. So models can be useful, but we need to know when they are useful. And why does this happen? So the mind is a prediction engine, right? It is trying to do two things. It is trying to understand what the environment is, what are the things. So it is useful for you to imagine that I'm speaking to you, because understanding that this is like digital information converted here, converted back there, and coming on your screen and all these things in pixels, it is not really useful, right? So the model works for that purpose. So the mind is a prediction engine. It takes the environment, reduces the environment into models. So even when it reduces the environment, what it does is it takes very little information. So at any point of time, if I was to extend my arm and have my thumb in front of me, so the size of my thumbnail nail is literally the portion where my eyesight is really focused. Okay. And 96% of the visual area of my brain, visual part of my brain, is processing just that area. And only 4% is actually looking at the rest of the room, right? So it is just predicting, okay, there is a lamp, there is a bottle, there is a clock, there is a wardrobe. It's just predicting from very little information. It's filling in the gaps. And that is why we have optical illusions, right? So we are not seeing exactly what reality is. We are reducing reality into models in our mind. So not only do we sample a small part of reality, we further compress it into mental models that in the minimum amount of information try to tell us what is actually happening. Great. So just that's a little bit of food for thought, because it will be very relevant for what comes next. This is a quote by Sariputta about the Buddha. Sariputta was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples, so Sariputta and Moggallon. So in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 28, Middling Discourses of the Buddha, Sariputta says at one point, now this has been said by the Blessed One. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma, and one who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. So I'll just let that sink in. So this is a central, so what is the Dhamma? We talked about this. In this context, the Dhamma is the underlying mechanism of mental experience, of human experience. What is it that makes experience happen, right? Dhamma is also the teaching that presents that, and Dhamma is also the phenomena or the experiences themselves that we have. And the Buddha is reported to have said, one who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma, and one who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. So that's how important the Buddha thought this understanding was. And this is what we're going to begin with. Before we get there, I will refresh in your memory one more thing we discussed. So the Buddha always liked to use two tools a lot: classification and root cause analysis. So when he talks about the noble truths, truth of suffering, origin of suffering, and cessation of suffering by cessation of the origin of suffering, right? So A is dependent on B, and if B is gone, A will not be supported. So he always talks about conditions supporting whatever is coming. And you see that, right? You see in your practice that depending maybe on what conversation you had earlier in the day, that thing might come up because those conditions are right in your mind. Depending on whether you give attention, your thought mind may go away with that thought. Depending on if you use if you keep your attention away from it, it might go on its own. Or if your attention goes after that thought, use the 6 hours, you can come back again. So dependent on the condition, different phenomena exist, and when the conditions change, the phenomena cease to. Okay, so this is the understanding that the Buddha uses to explain human experience, explain or rather dissect the different dependent phenomena. Okay, so we are going to look at, so this is given in 12 different steps, and we are going to look at it in 3 different sections. So what is the current foundation? What is the current system? What is the current being that we are entering into this moment? What is our interaction with the environment? And what is the behavior that results out of it? Okay. So the first link that the Buddha talks about is avidya or ignorance. Ignorance of what? Ignorance of how the mind works. Not understanding how the mind works, assuming everything, taking everything personally, making everything into a threat or opportunity at all points of time. Not understanding how craving works, how the mind works, how this process of the mind works. Because we don't, we start developing our conditioning. We talked about Sankara, personalized conditioning. So by taking things personally, we develop personalized conditioning. Impressions from all the actions we have taken in life. So depending on how we have taken decisions, we reinforce a certain conditioning in us, and depending on what experiences we have had, we reinforce certain conditioning in us. So this is all driven by taking things personally, right? So some people are afraid of the dark, afraid of certain animals. Some people are gravitated towards it. People have different conditioning depending on what experiences they were exposed to and how they responded to it, how they understood it in their mind. Dependent on this, we have consciousness, information processing ability. So different people have different information processing ability also. So you might see somebody who has like extremely good spatial awareness, right? They are able to see if things are out of place. They're able to see different things when they enter a certain space. And there'll be another person who's dreamy, right? So they have no idea of what the space is. They are in their own mind, or they see visually, but they don't process the same kind of information. So this is also derived by conditioning. This is colored by conditioning. And you'll see this process go throughout, right? So every step will be conditioned by the previous step. In a way, you can think of these links of dependent origination as different floors of an apartment, right? So any floor on top needs all the floors below that to be in place for it to exist. If any of the floors below don't exist, then the whole edifice comes down, right? So dependent on one mechanism or condition comes the next mechanism or condition. The next part is Namarupa or mentality materiality. The link between the mental realm and the physical realm. How do these two interact, right? So that is mentality materiality. And then we have the sense bases, right? Six sense bases we talked about: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, right? These are sensors for information. So these are our windows to the world. This information that can be processed by the sense bases is all the information that we can make sense of. Without these, we cannot make sense of anything. And again, you can see, if there was no consciousness, if there was no link between consciousness, the ability to process information, and the sense base, then these sense bases would not be able to interact with the environment, right? So if you lost your vision, right, even though you have an eye, even though you have a connect, you won't have the connection, and therefore you won't be able to see things, right? So there is this pattern of dependence. Dependent on sense basis, with sense basis as a condition. So the way the Buddha would call this, would teach this is talking about with A as condition, B comes to be. So with ignorance as condition, conditioning comes to be. With conditioning as a condition, consciousness comes to be. With consciousness as condition, mentality, materiality comes to be. With mentality, materiality as condition, sense basis come to be. With a sense basis as condition, contact comes to be. So contact is a information event. Three things need to come together. So there has to be some information in the physical realm, something. So light's coming towards you, a sound is coming towards you, a thought is arising in your mind, and or a smell is coming to you, a flavor is coming to you. So your sense base plus your consciousness plus an input in the physical realm. When these three things come together, then you have something called contact, or phassa is called. It's called in Pali, and in Sanskrit or Hindi, you can call it sparsh, right? So sparsh, that moment of contact, your ability to process information, your sensors, and information coming from outside. So we live in a world of smartphones. Might have been much harder to explain this to people, but you have your camera, you have the light, right? And you have the operating system behind it that takes you have the camera app behind it that come together, right? Similarly for recording sound. So it's easier for us to understand. Might have taken more of an effort for people at the Buddha's time to understand how this works. Based on contact, so with sense basis as condition, contact comes to be. So if there were no sense basis, then the contact would not happen. With contact as condition, feeling comes to be, or sensation comes to be. So this is again one of the aggregates we discussed yesterday. And this comes with contact as condition. So if there's no contact, there would be no feeling. So before we go into concepts, there is an alert that comes, which is painful, pleasant, neutral. We talked about the example of touching something hot, for instance, right? Painful feeling will come up. This is the interaction with the environment. So we had a moment of interaction with the environment. Now comes the interesting part. With feeling as condition, craving comes to be. I mentioned earlier, right, when we talk about the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, dukkha, the origin of suffering, dukkha samudaya, which is craving or tanha or trishna in Hindi. Trishna is the word in Hindi and Sanskrit for craving. And the third noble truth says, with the cessation of craving, cessation of tanha, comes the cessation of suffering. This is called dukkha nirodha, right? So craving is a very important part, and this is the first time we start taking things personally. So far, we came into this moment. We have a certain configuration, our conditioning, consciousness, sense bases, etc. So at this time, they're active or they're not. If I'm sleeping, my sense base of the eye is not active, for instance, right? And if I'm sleeping, probably my sense base of hearing is also not active in the same way. It may be hearing what's happening in my dream, but it's not directed towards the outside world, for instance, right? With feeling as condition comes craving. So at any point of time, you have many contacts happening around you, right? You have, for me, for example, there is some wind coming from the air conditioner, there is light coming from the screen, from a lamp, there is the sound of the air conditioner. I can smell a very nice candle in the background. Right? So I have multiple events of contact happening, and all of them are giving different feelings. Now, attention is what helps us to decide between different feelings. So we are, like I said, we are always looking for threats and opportunities. That's our evolutionary wiring. Feeling represents that. So the more our mind thinks of something as a threat, the more painful the feeling, and the more the mind thinks of something as a opportunity, the more pleasant the feeling. And in general, painful or threat will always trump pleasant because that can just stop our journey here, right? I can maybe still find a pleasant or good opportunity or good outcome. So that always takes precedence. Now the mind has to figure out with so many things happening around me, where do I pay attention, right? And feeling and craving come together for that. So once a painful feeling comes, your mind grips around that, says it is seeking for information, for attention. And your mind grips around that, saying, okay, this is something important. And it comes with a I like it, I don't like it point of view. Right? So you might smell something that you don't like, and immediately your mind goes, I don't like it. Whatever it is, I don't like it. You may not even be able to figure out what the smell is, but I don't like it. Personalized engagement of attention. And why personalized? Personalizing gets you primed for action, taking things personally. So if you don't care, if you don't have a personal investment in a situation, your attention won't really go there. Right. So if you're walking on the road and a bus is hurtling towards you, one thing you can do is you can calculate the physics of the bus traveling at a certain speed, being made of metal. You are made of skin and bone and flesh. And what will happen if it comes and hits you? But we'll probably not survive if we are calculating like that every moment, right? So as soon as there is personalized engagement of attention, I like it, I don't like it mind. So our entire mind body is like do what I like or like solve for what I like or what I don't like, right? And we jump like I'm going to get out of the way. I'm not going to do any calculations, not look at it objectively. So craving personalizes the engagement. It brings the I. For the first time, it is about I. Before that, you are a being, you're a system that's coming, and there is different things that is happening in it. Now it is about how I feel about. With this comes upadan or clinging. Now we start adding models to what's happening. Right. So as we are jumping, as we've noticed this, we've got that feeling of fear. So this food, for example, the feeling here would not only be a feeling of fear, it would be unpleasant feeling. It would already be priming our body for action, right? And as we are ready, getting ready to take that action, at the same time, our mind is also saying, okay, what exactly is happening? We need to model what's happening. We can't just say, I don't like it because our immediate reaction may not be always the best reaction, right? So we want to kind of make sense of the story. Am I doing the right thing? I want to be able to make sense of it. So we have world modeling, which is driven by craving. It's just driven by the fact that you took it personally. With craving as condition, clinging comes to. So the why of what's happening starts coming in. The storytelling, the world modeling. So I see that there is a bus and I need to get out of the way. Like I need to save myself. Why am I doing what am I doing? Right. So that story comes here. And we'll take more examples to understand what could be the other ways that clinging might come to be. What we're doing while we're with clinging is also reducing the world. So when you were in school, when you solve a maths problem or a physics problem, for instance, what you actually do is try to understand the description, the English that is given, and understand the physics principles behind it and reduce it to a mathematical equation that you know how to solve. So the mind is always reducing the environment into things that it has solved before, right? I see a person for the first time, I see their body language, the way they're speaking. I'm trying to get a sense. Is this person trustworthy? Is this person reliable? Is this person aggressive? Is this person polite? I start trying to reduce the situation into things I've already seen before, I've experienced before. So we reduce the world into models, into something that is a solved problem, because it is easier for us to take action on a solved problem. It is harder if you have to actually start solving the problem from scratch. And this is where a lot of our modeling can take us to the wrong conclusion. Based on that, we start going into a library of habitual action, right? So somebody says a joke and you are ready to roll your eyes, right? So at it, or you're irritated about how offensive the joke is, or you find it extremely funny and you laugh at it, right? So conditioning is playing a role in all of this. Like I said, every floor is influencing all the floors above it, but you have a certain habitual pattern, right? So to react to a certain situation, somebody does something you don't like, you might have a violent reaction. And one day it might come out as shouting, one day it might come out as physical violence, one day it might come out as just maybe banging something, banging your desk or whatever, right? So once we start going into the library of clinging driven habitual action, what are our habits? What is the typical way we solve this problem? We go into an action which is very context specific. It's happening in that moment. It may be affected by what happened before. So the judge's library of habitual actions and the actual behavior may be influenced by the fact by how hungry they are, right? So the conditions that preceded. But we have a set of habitual actions, and we based on that we take an action that is suitable for that specific moment, right? So for example, if you play a certain sport and you, let's say, a racket sport or cricket, right? You know if the ball is coming to you in a certain way, I'm going to hit it in a certain kind. So you have that library of habitual actions, and eventually the actual action that you take depends on the specific situation you are confronted with. And once there is action, there is, so the way the Buddha describes it, with birth of reaction as condition, aging and death comes to be. So this is consequences, right? So consequences and any dissatisfaction that comes out of those consequences. So any action that you take is like a dropping a pebble on a surface of water. The ripples will start from there, and the ripples will cause different things that happen in different places. So this is the process of dependent origination that the Buddha taught. How we are going, like, really, really zooming in now. So we talked about a slice of time. Now we're talking about how we arrive at a certain slice of time. So this is how our experience comes to be. I'll read out the whole sequence again, and then we'll take a couple of examples to illustrate what's happening. With ignorance as condition, personalized conditioning comes to be. With personalized conditioning as condition, consciousness comes to be. With consciousness as condition, mentality, materiality comes to be. With mentality, materiality as condition, sense basis come to be. With sense basis as condition, contact comes to be. With contact as condition, feeling comes to be. With feeling as condition, craving comes to be. With craving as condition, clinging comes to be. With clinging as condition, habitual patterns come to be. With habitual patterns as condition, birth of reaction comes to be. With birth of reaction as condition, aging, death, and consequences come to be. Okay, I'll just take a pause for a minute, and then we'll take a couple of examples to illustrate this, and then look at why is this understanding useful and important for us. Just hydrate quickly. Okay, so let's take an example. Two people live in the same house. One person likes to maintain a tidy house, the other person doesn't. Now let's call, say, A is the tidy person and B is the untidy person. Let's say B left a sock in the room and A walked in. Okay. So the first thing that happens is contact. Their eyes, the light reflecting of that sock, and the ability to process information comes. For this person, now the way they are conditioned, they are tidy, they take a lot of effort to keep things tidy. They immediately get a painful sensation. After this, craving kicks. Painful sensation, attention goes. So if there was not a painful sensation, maybe attention wouldn't have gone there, which probably happened with B, the untidy person, right? So because of their conditioning, they didn't get a painful sensation. They got simply a neutral sensation, and their mind was focusing on something else that was painful or pleasant. So person A got personalized with this. Their attention became personalized with this. I don't like it. Okay? Now, based on this, I don't like it as your attention stays. So, as your attention stays, your attention is the fuel for thoughts. We've seen this in our practice. The more we keep our attention with a thought, the bigger and bigger the story goes. We go deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole. The story sustains for that long. So, with attention and craving as the fuel, clinging comes to. Now, the says that yet again, this has happened. B has left this sock on the floor. B did not pick it up. Okay. So that is the first layer of modeling that happens. Now, maybe there is a very important task that A has to attend to and they go and the story stops there. But in case the attention is continued there, so there'll be multiple loops of this happening, this contact, feeling, craving, playing. And then the story will advance. So this is not the first time this has happened. In fact, this is the third time this has happened this week. Why is B such a slob? Why can't they pick up after themselves? Why do I have to do it? What is the amount of responsibility I am taking? What is wrong with them? Do they not care about me? Or is it a fault in their, how they've been brought up? Or is it just a lack of responsibility or carelessness? And this can keep going on and on and on. I can see some of you nodding. Okay. So clinging is story, that model, right? And these models, like we said, may not always be useful. They are always wrong. Sometimes they may be useful, sometimes they may not be useful. But here, the clinging, the modeling of the world is driven by craving, driven by the fact that you don't like. So when you like something, you choose certain models to represent that, right? And when you don't like something, you use different models to represent that. So if you take a simple example, let's assume there are two political parties. Okay. You like one and you dislike one. Okay. So whenever the one that you like does something wrong or does something badly, you're like, it was accidental. They had no other option. And look at all the other good stuff there. Okay. And if the other person does it wrong, you'll be like, this is they have no intention to do right things. They just want to do things like this. And flip it the other way around. If the person that you support does something good, then it is intentional. It is a demonstration of their intention and commitment and responsibility. If the other person does something good, your story will be it was accidental or they have to do something good at least. What about all the bad stuff that they've done? Right. So depending on how the craving is engaged with the situation, our world modeling is completely change, right? So for example, the judge was listening to a story of a criminal. Maybe he had some level of revulsion towards what the person has done. But because he was also getting hungry, the storytelling, the craving, the dislike of that became bigger and the storytelling also became different. Okay. So clinging would have been that. Now your habitual pattern might have been to maybe throw things around, So person A might decide to throw things around, might decide to call up B and give them a dressing down immediately, or might decide to put it somewhere or leave it, whatever. So you might have different habitual patterns, getting annoyed, getting judgmental, all these things, and you may take an action depending on the circumstance, depending on that particular moment in time. And then this will have consequence to how you will, because you spend time there, because of the craving, because of the clinging, because of the action that you chose to do. So whether if you acted on it, if you made a noise about it, if you had a fight about it, depending on that, there'll be consequence, right? So then those consequences are not limited to that moment. So there is a complete the ripples from that pebble dropping into the water will go out and cause repercussions further. Okay, so that was one example. Another example that came in the previous retreat was somebody saw an old colleague who was working at the same level get a job that they were applying for and they did not, right? So immediately there was an unpleasant fear. They saw their attention went because they saw somebody familiar. They saw the company name that was familiar, and there was a painful feel. And then the mind was, I don't like it, right? And then there was a story, entire storytelling. Is there something wrong with me? Do I mess up my interviews? Why is that person better than me? He has better luck than me. So that entire kind of storytelling happens till you understand. So, what is the use of understanding this if we have no way out of it, right? So, we can understand it, but tomorrow, if we are going to do the same thing, how does it help us? How does understanding this help us? Are we like doomed to repeating our compulsive behavior, right? So, now we come back to understanding what the Buddha said, right? So, Buddha said, craving is the source of suffering. So, if you look at this, craving is the point. So you have environment interactions happen. We can change our environment to some extent, and that is something we'll discuss later on during the retreat. But let's assume that you are in this moment, there is an environment that is sending different information to you, different contacts are happening. Craving is the point where things start getting taken personally and where you will possibly end up taking an action. So what could have been the alternate route, right? So if we use the 6R, recognize that our mind is attached with craving in a certain thought. So the irritation, the tightness that you feel immediately when you see that, when that person A sees that thought, right? Release it, let that thought be, relax the tension and tightness in your mind. Stop getting engaged with that with a personalized attention. Smile and come back to a wholesome state and take a distance of that wholesome state. So you understand that this has happened, right? When you're not in that story, that craving driven storytelling, craving driven world modeling, you can simply say, okay, this has happened and this needs to be addressed, right? So let's have a conversation. But for now, let me just pick it and put it away. Could be as simple as that. But we don't normally go down that behavior. We basically go down the slope of our compulsions, compulsive behavior. We just slide down. It takes a moment of consciousness to step out of that slide and actually do something that can have less harmful consequences for us. Because if we go down that slope, we'll create suffering for ourselves and for the other person as well, other people that are involved in that situation. So that's why the Buddha said work with craving. And the great thing about craving is it's tangible as that tension and tightness. Think of it as if ignorance is, you can think of it, it's a little different, but maybe from contact, you can start seeing it as the river Ganga, right? So it starts at a glacier, the Gangotri. It's dripping very slowly. It becomes a stream, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And finally, at some point, it you have the Kosi River, right? So which is famous for its floods and causing a lot of devastation in yeah, right. So at different points, things keep going out of control, out of proportion. As we start from contact, feeling, craving, clinging, habitual patterns, birth of reaction, and consequence. So craving is a point upstream enough that you can actually take action. You can two things that are working for us. One, you can detect it by training your mindfulness to find that tightness and tension. Two, you can use the 6 hours more effectively. The more emotional you are, the more agitated you are, the more times you need to use the 6 hours, the more it'll take more cycles of reducing that craving before you can come out of that. So that's what the Buddha presented in the Four Noble Truths. And craving is the point upstream where we can actually, it is the very beginning of the compulsive part of our behavior in a situation. And that is where we can actually make a difference by using the 6 hours and bringing our mind to a wholesome state. So, anybody, for example, you have close family members, spouses, see that most of the times a lot of the arguments are so unoriginal. It is just a repetition of the same set of accusations that go back and forth. And that is happening because every time we choose to go through the compulsive slide, right? Instead, if you have that moment of consciousness, use the 6 hours, step out. Understand that we are responding to models. Nobody is always or never in a certain way, right? Or if we are talking to somebody who has a different idea, right? Nobody's always or never in a certain way. Those are just the models in our mind that colors things in a certain way. What is actually needed right now? Is your opinionated agitation and anger needed, or is something else needed? What is the action that actually makes sense, right? So being able to understand that. So people can get very, very emotional about political statements. And maybe the action that is actually available to you is to vote once every 4 years. Or maybe you are involved in some actual, legitimate action, activity, RTIs, activism or, lobbying or something. You are actually involved in an activity where this makes a difference. But if you're just simply using it to burn your blood, maybe that's not a great choice. Maybe that's not a slide you want to go down again and again. And because it has consequences, it has consequences for you. Every action that we take, if you remember what we see, personalized conditioning, sanskar, every action that we take, every experience that we have colors this condition. As you start using the 6 hours, what starts to change is you start to take actions that are rooted in wisdom instead of ignorance. So, in all the different traditions in India, right, all the spiritual traditions, religion, the fundamental is always never an axis between evil and good. Like fundamentally, the understanding, especially in Buddhism, the understanding is that the axis goes from ignorance towards wisdom. People either act out of ignorance, where they create suffering for themselves and for other people, or they act out of wisdom, where they create the minimum suffering for themselves or other people. So as you use the 6 hours, you can start setting up a new apartment block, which is based on wisdom. And your conditioning will also be, right? So if you decide not to race every person who overtakes you on the road, over time it doesn't bother you that somebody overtakes you because your conditioning changes. The feeling changes, the craving changes, the clinging changes. And you also become used to stepping out of craving. So that's what I wanted to present about dependent origination. It's a lot of information. The video will be accessible for you to look at. We'll also share this image on the WhatsApp group. Don't worry about understanding this immediately because you will start seeing this in your practice. When the most valuable experience, the most valuable teaching is the one that you give yourself by practicing. You'll see how it goes from the tightness to a thought, how habitual or compulsive those thoughts are, how reductive those models are. So you can reflect on that. You can see what's happening in your practice. Don't worry too much about trying to see all these things at the moment. You can reflect about it after the practice. Otherwise, your practice will just get confused and scattered. In your practice, just see that what happens when you deal with craving with a thought. If you don't deal with craving, how that thought can become big and the craving becomes harder to get rid of. So just in your practice, all you need to do is continue using the 6 hours, but later on you can reflect in your actions in the day. For example, you can reflect actions that you identify cause suffering for yourself and for other people. You can try to see what is happening. So don't make any changes to your meditation because of this. But just because, again, I have talked about some of the landmarks in the territory, your mind will automatically start registering some of these things. As we go deeper and deeper, we start seeing the different links of dependent origination. But don't go looking for them. Don't try to see each one of these. Otherwise you'll just disturb your practice for now. It's just another seed being planted in your mind for now. And you can look at destructive, self-destructive, or destructive of other tendencies that you might have, and see how this entire river is going into that state of flood where you find it very difficult to control. And is there a point right in the beginning that you can actually choose to move towards the conscious side? Great. I've been talking for a very long time today. Thanks for staying there, being alert, and smiling through it. Happy to hear any thoughts, questions. If you want, I can put up the, if you had a specific question and you don't remember the names, I can put it up again on the screen.
Yeah, hi, Raji. Yeah, so it's not like I'm not sure if it is like a relevant question, but it's out of curiosity. You can say like I'm just posing
Yeah.
this question. So, what I'm trying to understand is that between thoughts and action, what do you think would be like the greater definer of wisdom? So, for example, like in a situation, I'm agitated about something, and by use of 6 hours, I have calmed myself, I've released that thought, and now I'm all okay. But I still go ahead and do my compulsive behavior, like, so there's no change in my action, although I have found that mental peace. Now, instead of that action coming out of anger, it may be coming out of mischief, so to speak.
Okay.
That's one way. And then another thing is that now, if suppose I have not fixed my mindset with the use of 6 hours, I'm still smoldering under that anger or whatever it is, but I act as if everything's okay and I do the right thing or the composed things. Now, out in these two scenarios, which one do you think is like closer to this or closer to, what we should aspire to?
Okay. So, as I understood it, the first one you said is okay, craving is not resulting, if you taking away craving is not resulting in behavior change, right? So that's what you're saying, that my state of mind may be different. So just look, I mean, just go back to the example of the judges, right? So the way the mental state is definitely affecting decision making and action making, and you know this. So for example, if you, if the same person, the example of tidy person and untidy person, right? So A had something important, they did not get in that agitated state, they go through a different set of actions. So again, what is important is this dependent nature, right? So dependent on clinging, dependent on craving, your specific patterns will come to be. Now what might happen is eventually, even though you don't have the same kind of craving, your action may not vary too much, but over time your craving for that, as you teach your mind that something is not important, right? So just take the example of traffic, right? So you might use the 6 hours, but still you may already have a habitual tendency of it. So they don't act in isolation. So it's not like I took the craving out, but my habitual tendency is exactly the same. So it is colored. The more time you spend thinking about it, the more irritated you get, and the more violent your action will be. The less time you take it personally, it will affect the how agitated you are about it and how you act about it. So it may not completely, like you use a 6, it's not a weapon to just terminate one compulsive behavior.
It's not
It
zero or one.
starts changing the goalpost more and more, and you start acting less on the basis of craving and more on the basis of what is appropriate and what is wisdom, right? So wisdom is not posing a certain image to the world, right? Wisdom is understanding for yourself that by doing something, I'm actually creating suffering for myself and for others. So when you shout at someone, so there's a very nice sutta in which the Buddha says it's a very simple thing, right? 2 by 2 matrix. And again, I'm sure it was like revolutionary in his time, like 2,500 years ago. So he simply says divide action into things that are pleasant now, but have painful consequences, pleasant now and have pleasant consequences. So pleasant now and have painful consequences can be some kind of self addiction, for example, right? Pleasant now, painful consequences. Pleasant now, pleasant later, smiling, right? Or something like that. Painful now, pleasant later, maybe it's exercise or, applying yourself to your work. Painful now and painful later, getting agitated. It's going to create poor consequences. Like revolutionary 2 by 2 matrix for like 2,500 years ago, right? And so that's the way you've got to see it, right? So this entire building, every floor is dependent on the other, and every time we take an action not based on craving, you're changing your sanskara, you're changing your conditioning. So the feeling will be colored by that, the how painful you find something, how irritating you find something, or how attractive you find something. So over time, what is your compulsion for wanting to have something or not wanting to have something? How strong is your craving? How strong is your mindfulness? Right. So what happens is mindfulness using the 6 hours start getting added to your habitual patterns, library of habitual patterns. Whereas once you only had the option of going to the compulsive actions, now you have additional options in your library of habitual patterns, right? Which is using the 6 hours, using mindfulness, using loving kindness in that situation, using forgiveness in that situation. So you have a new library of habitual patterns and new library of action. So you're kind of slowly moving, shifting the entire momentum from one side to the other. Does that help?
Yeah, that's clear. Thanks, Raj.
Great question, by the way.
Thanks. You're very kind.
Anyone else? Okay, you can always ask me questions in our check-in or say make a note of it for tomorrow's session. Okay, so we'll share some merit and we will call it a day. Those who can, I would suggest it's always great to have a sit after the talk because you've been told about the landmarks and your mind will see the landmarks in a way that you don't need to do intellectually. Your mind is seeing things, learning things continuously. Like when you ride a bike, you don't intellectualize every single thing. You just learn through actively doing something, right? Okay. May suffering ones be suffering free and the fear struck fearlessly. May the grieving shed all grief and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May enlightened beings of mighty power share in this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.